November 18, 3:12 p.m. Denver. I hadn't even set my daughter-in-law's phone on the counter when the technician, a young man named Alex, went pale. He lowered his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Mrs. Reynolds, what I found inside this phone." He swallowed hard. "Someone is trying to kill you. And it's your son." My hands trembled before I could hide them. A second sound cut through the small repair shop. A sharp electronic beep. The payment terminal flashed in red letters. "Card declined, account frozen. Authorized by Jake R. Wilson." For a moment I thought I'd misread it. My own son had frozen my bank account minutes before I walked in. I stood there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, holding a phone that held their plans, dates, messages, and conversations about ending my life. And all I could think was, how could they do this to me? If you want the full story, you're in the right place. Now let me start from the beginning. My name is Martha Reynolds, and at 62 I move a little slower, but my mind is the same one that carried me through 40 years in emergency rooms. I spent my life under fluorescent lights and ringing monitors, holding hands in final moments, calling out orders, pressing my weight into chests that did not want to breathe. I learned to recognize real confusion, real decline. Jake was my only child. He arrived on a cold January morning between my shifts, swaddled in a hospital blanket that smelled faintly of antiseptic. His childhood was measured in visiting hours and takeout boxes. I missed school plays because some stranger's heart had stopped. I missed Christmas Eve once because of a pileup on the highway. When he was little, he would draw pictures of me in scrubs with a red cross on my chest. When he was older, he stopped drawing and started asking, "Are you working again?" With a flatness I pretended not to hear. I kept going. The mortgage needed paying. His college fund needed filling. The overtime shifts were my way of loving him, even if the shape of that love didn't feel soft. I showed up where I could. Science fairs, parent meetings squeezed between nights, birthday cakes baked at odd hours. I remember icing cupcakes at 4 in the morning, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. By the time Jake was in his 30s, he spoke of my dedication to work as if it were a character flaw. "You never knew when to stop, Mom," he'd say, shaking his head. "You still don't." I heard criticism, I also heard hurt. I carried both like two sides of the same coin, and I told myself families survive these things. People grow, they forgive in their own ways. I didn't realize he was filing my choices away like evidence. Then came Grace. She arrived at a Sunday dinner wearing a cream blazer and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything about her was precise. Her hair, her watch, the way she sat at my table and placed her phone screen down but within reach, as if the world might call for her at any moment. She introduced herself as a financial consultant, saying it with the same tone I used to say nurse to worried families, calm, practiced, reassuring. Only with her, reassurance never quite landed. I tried to welcome her. I set out the blue plates I use for special occasions. I made Jake's favorite pot roast and mashed potatoes the way my mother taught me. I even washed and set aside his old chipped college mug, the one with the faded mountain logo, because he once told me coffee tasted better from it. Grace watched all of this like someone reviewing a file. "You didn't have to fuss," she said, but there was no warmth in it. They came to lean on me more than I expected. There were calls about a temporary cash flow issue when they were buying their condo. There were questions about whether I could help with the down payment, just until the bonus clears. There were requests to use my address for a few months, while they sorted out something with the bank. It all sounded reasonable, wrapped in polite words and quick smiles. I had spent my life responding to emergencies. Saying no never felt like an option. I told myself this was what mothers did. Step in, steady the ship, make things easier for the next generation. When Jake talked about student loans and market volatility, I felt my age in a new way. I didn't understand all his terms, but I understood worry. So I opened my checkbook. I handed over bank cards for convenience. I let Grace sit at my kitchen table with her slim laptop, organizing my accounts while the smell of coffee and a lavender candle mixed in the air. She spoke gently then, her voice almost soothing. "We'll streamline everything for you, Martha. Fewer passwords, fewer things to track. You've carried enough." It sounded like kindness. After years of juggling charts and crisis, the idea of everything being simpler felt like a small mercy. I watched her hands move quickly over the keys. If there were warning signs, they were quiet ones. A look that passed between them when I asked a question twice. The way Grace would say, "Don't worry about it, I've got it," in a tone that closed the subject rather than invited me in. The way Jake stopped explaining things and started patting my shoulder instead. Little shifts. Slight chills in the room I kept trying to warm with casseroles and fresh flowers. I told myself they were just busy. That this was how modern life sounded, very fast, efficient, a little curt. I did not yet understand that they were rearranging the story of who I was, even as I sat right there at my kitchen table, refilling their glasses and asking how work was going. I thought I knew my son. I thought I could read a situation. I had no idea that in the quiet spaces between our dinners and their requests, a different version of me was being written, one that would make everything they did next look reasonable on paper. The first sign, small, almost delicate, came 6 months ago at a little bistro Jake liked downtown. The place smelled of rosemary and warm bread, and the tables were set so close together that conversations mingled like loose threads. I remember smoothing the napkin across my lap as the waitress approached, ready to take our drink orders. I hadn't even reached for my menu when Grace leaned toward the young woman, lowering her voice as if sharing something fragile. "My mother-in-law has been forgetful lately," she said. Her tone was soft, practiced, almost sympathetic. The waitress turned her eyes toward me with that quiet, pitying expression people reserve for those they believe are slipping. I felt heat rise in my face. I waited for Grace to laugh, to wave it off, to say she was exaggerating. She didn't. Jake didn't correct her either. He just gave a slow, understanding nod, one that landed deeper than any insult. A nod that suggested this was an ongoing concern. I let out a small, uneasy laugh. "I'm perfectly fine. Just tired from the drive." Grace took a sip of water, unbothered. The waitress remained gentle with me the rest of the evening, speaking slowly, as if each word required careful placement. I wanted to tell her I'd worked trauma bays that never slept, that I'd triaged half a dozen emergencies at once, that I could still recall medication dosages without checking a chart. But explaining myself felt strangely out of place in my own life. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my car before starting the engine. I tried to remember whether I'd misplaced anything or repeated myself at dinner. Nothing came to mind. Still, the doubt lingered long after I reached home. A few days later, Jake stopped by unannounced. He walked through my house with a quiet deliberateness I had never seen in him. He checked the stove knobs, glanced into my pill organizer, opened and closed the refrigerator door. "Just making sure everything's good," he said. "You know, safety." He had never inspected my home before, not even after my knee surgery when I was actually unsteady on my feet. I watched him move from room to room like an evaluator, marking boxes in his mind. The next week, Grace called to remind me about a dentist appointment I supposedly scheduled. When I told her I didn't remember booking one, she paused just long enough to make the silence feel heavy. "It happens, Martha. Really. No need to be embarrassed." I hung up and looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. Every appointment was written in my own careful handwriting. There was no dentist visit, no forgotten note, no slip. But the doubt settled anyway, quiet and persistent. Little things piled on. Jake re-explained stories I already knew. Grace corrected me gently when I mentioned details she claimed I'd gotten wrong. "She's been a bit mixed up lately," she once whispered to a neighbor while I stood not 3 feet away. I laughed it off then too. But in the ER, I had learned something important. The first crack is never the loud one. It's the small fracture beneath the surface, the one you don't feel until the whole structure starts to shift. And that night at the bistro, that soft sentence delivered to a stranger, was the very first crack in the life I thought was still solid. It didn't change overnight. That was the cruelest part. Nothing exploded, nothing slammed shut. It was just a slow drop in temperature, the kind you only notice when you realize you're reaching for a sweater in your own home. It began with phrases that sounded helpful, even loving, if you didn't listen too closely. "Mom, you forgot again." "Mom, you left the stove on." "Mom, you're getting older. This isn't safe." The first time Jake said I had forgotten something, we were standing in my kitchen. I'd invited them for Sunday lunch. The roast was resting on the counter, the lavender candle was burning near the sink, and the old clock above the doorway ticked louder than usual. Grace sat at the table with her laptop open, half in my house and half in whatever spreadsheet owned her attention. Jake opened the oven, then frowned. "You were supposed to turn this off an hour ago, Mom. It's still on." I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over. The dial was set to off. The metal was warm, yes, but we had just finished cooking. Years of hospital routines had trained me to check and recheck anything that could burn, spill, or hurt someone. I knew I had turned it off. "It's warm because we used it," I said quietly. "It's off." Jake sighed, long and tired, like I disappointed him. "You see, Grace? This is what I'm talking about." Grace didn't look up from the screen. "Just make a note," she murmured. "For the doctor." "For the doctor?" I repeated. Jake patted my arm, the way I'd seen him soothe patients during his volunteer days as a teenager. "She just means we should mention it next time. No big deal." The conversation moved on to something else, interest rates I think, but the words clung to me like damp fabric. Make a note for the doctor. At my next checkup, my doctor scrolled through his tablet and frowned slightly. "Any confusion, Martha? Forgetting appointments? Trouble managing your meds?" I stared at him. "No. Should I be?" "Just asking," he said. "There are some concerns noted from family. Nothing urgent." Concerns noted. From family. On the drive home, I sat at a red light longer than I needed to, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine humming softly. Outside, people moved in and out of the pharmacy with small white bags, focused on their own problems. Inside my car, something small but solid shifted. Someone else had started telling my story for me. The comments started multiplying. "You forgot we were coming over, Mom," Jake said one evening, stepping into my living room with a grocery bag. "We talked about it on Tuesday." I opened my planner, the one I'd used for years. There was no note. I remembered thinking we might see each other, but we hadn't settled on a time. In his version, though, I had simply forgotten. Another time, Grace ran a finger along the edge of the stove and shook her head just slightly. "You left this burner on the other day," she said lightly. "We're just lucky nothing happened." "I didn't," I replied, but my certainty sounded thinner than I wanted. She gave me a soft, professional smile. "It's okay, Martha. Really. It's natural." Natural. As if I were a season changing. That word followed me to bed that night. I lay on my back, watching the slow rotation of the ceiling fan, and thought of all the patients I'd charted over the years. Every symptom documented, every change noted in careful, neutral language. Now, somewhere in a file I couldn't see, I was being described too. A few weeks later at church, a woman I'd known for years touched my elbow gently. "How are you managing on your own?" she asked. "Jake says you've been a bit scattered." Scattered. Forgetful. Unsafe. It was the same story told in different rooms. So I adjusted. I began talking to myself as I moved through the house, not out of confusion but out of defiance. Front door locked. Stove off. Keys in the bowl. I added extra notes to my calendar, circled in red. I stuck a small square of paper by the fridge that said, in my own neat handwriting, "Check stove." It wasn't for my memory. It was for my defense. Grace noticed it one afternoon. Her eyes lingered on the little note, and she smiled without warmth. "You're trying," she said. "See, Jake? She's trying." Trying. As if I were already losing. That weekend they arrived with takeout and a folder. We ate from cartons at the dining table my husband had built long ago, its surface worn smooth by years of plates and elbows. When we finished, Grace cleared a space and laid out a neat stack of papers. "These are just standard documents," she said. "Power of attorney, healthcare proxy, some banking forms. Nothing urgent. It's just smart to have them in place while you're still, clear." The word sat between us like a small, sharp object. "I am clear," I answered. I heard the steadiness in my own voice. It comforted me more than anything she'd said in months. Jake leaned forward, elbows on the table, his face arranged in patient concern. "Mom, please. We're trying to help. It's protection. With the memory things, it's the responsible step." The doctor agrees. The doctor agrees. Concern, forms, signatures. They were arranging them in front of me like a row of open doors I hadn't asked for. From the outside, it must have looked like love. From my chair at that old table, pen resting beside my untouched plate, It felt like the ground beneath me was being shifted, inch by inch, into their hands. I return now to that moment in the repair shop, the one that split my life neatly into before and after. The shop itself was nothing special, a narrow place between a laundromat and a pawn shop. Still, I remember every detail as if the scene has been pressed between glass. Alex stood behind the counter with Grace's phone in his hands. He couldn't have been more than 25. His sweatshirt sleeves were pushed up, and there was a tiny burn mark on one wrist. When he looked up at me, the casual confidence he had shown when I first walked in was gone. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said quietly, "I'm going to show you something. You might want to sit down." I didn't sit. I wrapped my fingers around the edge of the counter instead and nodded for him to continue. I stayed still. He tapped through a series of screens, his brows knitting together. "Your daughter-in-law has a hidden folder," he explained. "It's not obvious. You have to know which sequence to press." My heart beat louder than the low buzz of the fluorescent lights. "What kind of folder?" He turned the screen so I could see. A single icon sat in the corner of the display, disguised as a calculator app. When he opened it, a simple list appeared, each line cold and plain. At the top, in neat capital letters, was the folder name, Exit Plan. The first message he opened was from Jake. My son's name at the top of that thread hit me harder than any words underneath it. "Grace, she's already confused. The doctor is logging everything. It'll look natural soon." The timestamp was 5 days earlier. I felt my throat tighten. All those little comments about my memory, the looks exchanged over my head, the notes for the doctor. They were not stray worries. They were pieces of a script being written for an audience I hadn't met yet. Alex scrolled. Grace's reply appeared beneath it, as tidy as the fonts on a bank statement. Her policy is 1-8M. Once the house sells, we're set. Mexico by June. No more stress. I had signed the original policy years ago, back when insurance felt like prudence, not a countdown clock. Seeing the number attached to my potential absence made my skin go cold. I had become an asset, nothing more than a line in their projected future. There were more messages. Start increasing dosage next week. Slow is safer. Doctor agreed to note progressing confusion. Make sure she looks unsteady when we visit. We need witnesses. Each line stripped a layer of normalcy from the last months of my life. Moments I had second-guessed, doubts I had swallowed, now stood in front of me in black and white. Alex hesitated before switching to a different contact. His thumb hovered over the screen. "This part is worse," he said. "There's someone else." The name on the next thread made my stomach drop. Lisa, Arizona. Jake's messages to her were shorter, stripped of polite qualifiers. "When it's done, we leave. Grace thinks it's just her mom-in-law. She won't see it coming." Another one sent late at night. "You're sure about the dosage? I don't want mistakes. It has to look like natural decline." Lisa replied with a thumbs-up icon and a simple line. "We'll be together by summer. Just follow the plan." I stared at the glowing screen, my own reflection faintly visible over their words. My son, the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat while I drove home from night shifts, was planning not just my death, but a life that continued afterward. A life in another country, with another woman, funded by the destruction of the person who had worked herself raw to raise him. It was only then that my legs gave out. I didn't faint. I just folded. I sank slowly to the concrete floor, my back against the cool glass of the counter. The roughness of the ground pressed through the fabric of my slacks. I became acutely aware of small things. The hum of the old heater, the faint smell of burnt dust, the soft click of Alex locking the phone screen. He came around the counter and crouched beside me. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm so sorry," he said. I didn't know what I was looking at first. I thought maybe it was some TV script or something. But there are dates. Real names. Your bank's logo and screenshots. "Show me," I managed. He unlocked the phone again, more carefully this time. A secure notes app opened, protected by a separate passcode. Inside it were bullet points, each one like a stone dropped into water. Switch pills Tuesday. Keep originals hidden. Call doctor. Report more confusion. Mention stove. Calendar mistakes. Realtor meeting. Confirm value if sold quickly. Attic suitcase. Check clothes, passports, cash. And at the very bottom, one final line, marked with an asterisk and a date 2 weeks away. Finalize plan. No delays. There were screenshots too. One of my online banking dashboard balances circled. Another of an email from the insurance company confirming the updated beneficiary information. Grace's email address shown calmly on the screen, as if nothing about it was out of place. I felt a strangeness settle over me then. The same feeling I used to get standing outside a trauma room, reading a chart before walking in. You learn, in that line of work, to recognize a trajectory. Sometimes the scans, the labs, the notes form a line so clear you can see exactly where it leads unless someone intervenes. For the first time, I understood that I was the patient now. I stared at those messages, at my son's casual cruelty, at Grace's cold efficiency, at the quiet eagerness of a woman in Arizona, and I understood something else too. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had confused my trust for incapacity. They thought the story was already written. They did not yet know that I was about to pick up the pen myself. I did what I had always done in crisis. I took a slow breath, then another, and started to plan the steps that might save my life. By the evening of that same day, the quiet I carried inside me felt heavier than anything I had known in 40 years of emergency rooms. Shock doesn't come all at once. It arrives in thin layers, settling slowly until the world feels unfamiliar. I drove home along streets I could navigate blindfolded, yet every turn felt strange, as though the city itself had shifted while I was gone. The dashboard glow lit my hands steady on the wheel, but my thoughts moved in sharp, irregular lines. Nothing looked different, but nothing was the same. When I stepped inside the house, the air felt still, almost expectant. I set my purse on the table, touching the familiar ceramic bowl where I kept my keys. The small click of metal against porcelain grounded me for a heartbeat. Then I walked to the living room, sat down, and opened the notebook where I kept grocery lists and reminders. On a blank page, I wrote the date. Then a single sentence. They planned it together. The words looked too neat for what they meant. I opened my laptop and began checking every account, every file, every document I could access. I worked slowly, the way I once reviewed medical histories before entering a patient's room. I wanted to be sure of every detail, and what I found built itself into a pattern no imagination could have invented. 9 months earlier, Jake had submitted a new life insurance policy in my name. My signature appeared on all the forms, tilted slightly, the way mine looked only when rushed, but still close enough to pass. I stared at my forged name longer than I meant to. It felt like reading an obituary written for someone still breathing. Then the bank statements. Small withdrawals, $40, $60, $85, every other Friday. The amounts were so ordinary they blended into the background of groceries and gas. But scrolling backward, the pattern revealed itself. Each withdrawal made within an hour of Grace leaving the house for errands. She had moved close to $3,000 over 4 months, all to an account I didn't recognize. Next were the doctor's notes. I opened the patient portal and felt my breath slow. There were entries describing me as mildly disoriented, frequently forgetful, and at risk for progressive cognitive decline. None of these conversations had ever happened. I remembered each appointment clearly, the small talk, the blood pressure checks, the brief, uneventful examinations. But here, on the screen, was a parallel version of me, one they had built sentence by sentence. I moved to the guest bedroom next. Something about the way Grace had closed the closet door that last visit returned to me. A small, careful motion. I opened it now. Inside were 3 suitcases. Zippers closed. Handles down. Not empty. Packed. Clothes rolled tightly, toiletries arranged neatly, documents tucked into mesh pockets. Plane tickets printed and folded. I pulled one out. A one-way international flight in Jake's name, leaving in early June. No return date. I sank onto the edge of the bed. The suitcase beside me carried the faint scent of Grace's perfume. I unzipped a side pocket. Inside was an envelope wrapped in one of her scarves. Hundreds in cash. Receipts for withdrawals that didn't appear in their joint account. Notes scribbled in her handwriting. Keep separate. Don't mention. Hold until last week. She had her own plan, one Jake knew nothing about. I moved back to the office. On the desk lay a stack of real estate flyers I didn't remember seeing. Each circled in pen. each representing the possible sale of my house. In my email, I found the thread that explained them. Grace had forwarded messages to Jake, discussing a realtor willing to move discreetly, and advising him that older homeowners rarely fight quick sales. They had estimated the value of my home, subtracting imagined repair costs and fees. Their voices in the emails were calm, efficient, as though negotiating the price of a used car. I kept reading until the lines blurred. Night settled around the house unnoticed. The lavender candle on my desk had burned halfway down before I realized I had lit it. I closed the laptop, but the silence that followed felt louder. In the kitchen, I made tea the way I always had, kettle filled, flame turned low, mug warmed with hot water first. Rituals helped in the ER. They help in shock too. The steam rose gently, fogging my glasses as I stood by the window. Outside, porch lights blinked on along the street like slow stars. I whispered into the stillness, "I see it now." My voice sounded different, steadier, older, but also clearer. For the first time there was no doubt. No maybe, no perhaps I'm overthinking. Just the truth, plain and undeniable. They had planned it together. And yet they would have betrayed each other too. That realization settled over me like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Their loyalty hadn't been to each other. It had been to the future they imagined without me. And once I was gone, they would have dismantled one another with the same quiet efficiency they had practiced on me. I stood there for a long time, the mug warm between my palms, watching the darkness gather outside my window. My life was still here, my photographs, my plants, my worn quilt on the couch. But I understood finally that I was living inside something broken. I turned off the kettle, straightened the edges of the napkin on the table, and sat down again. If they had mapped out a future without me, then I would have to map out one without them. And I would do it carefully, quietly, and with the same steady resolve I had taught myself across decades of saving strangers. I closed the notebook and wrote one more line beneath the first. They have no idea who I still am. That night, after uncovering every betrayal tucked quietly into the corners of my life, I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I sat in my car in the driveway, hands resting on the wheel even though the engine was off. The metal beneath the hood clicked softly as it cooled, the way it always did after a long day, but tonight that familiar sound felt distant. The street lamp near the mailbox flickered in its usual pattern, 3 slow pulses then steady, but even that look changed, as if the world had shifted by a few degrees. I closed my eyes and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. The faint lavender scent from the hanging car freshener drifted around me. For years it had meant comfort after long shifts, something gentle to greet me after hours spent watching life tilt at the edge. Now it carried something different. It reminded me of the person I had been before the truth revealed itself piece by piece, like small lights clicking on in a dark hallway. When I lifted my head, the house stood quiet and familiar, yet I saw it with a new kind of clarity. Every chip in the paint, every creak of the porch, every memory woven into its walls, all of it remained mine. Jake and Grace had tried to turn my home into a stage for a story I never agreed to, but the house itself had not betrayed me. It waited the way steady things do, until someone was ready to claim them again. I didn't move for several minutes. I simply breathed slow and steady, counting each breath to settle the shaking inside my chest. Years in the ER had taught me that panic clouds judgment. Clarity comes from stillness. And stillness in moments like this is an act of defiance. Finally, I reached for my purse. My fingers brushed the edge of my notebook, the one where I wrote grocery lists and phone numbers. Earlier that day, I had written a single sentence. They planned it together. Now, inside the quiet of my car, I whispered it aloud, not to wound myself, but to acknowledge the truth fully. Naming something gives it shape. Understanding it gives you direction. I opened the car door. The night air was colder than I expected, crisp enough to sting my cheeks. Gravel shifted under my shoes as I walked toward the house. I paused at the door, studying the small scratch near the lock, the one Jake had made months earlier when he insisted on taking my spare keys just in case. I had thought nothing of it. Now it felt like the first brushstroke in a painting I had misread. Inside, I turned on a single lamp in the living room. The warm light pushed back the shadows but did not erase the sense of hollow quiet that lingered. On the bookshelf sat a photograph of Jake at 10 years old, holding a small science fair trophy. His hair was sticking up in 3 directions, and he had grinned at the camera with unfiltered joy. I picked up the frame and looked at it for a long time. The boy in the picture had trusted me. The man he became had chosen a different path. I didn't cry. I simply turned the frame face down on the shelf and let the silence hold the moment. I walked through the house slowly, touching small things as though reacquainting myself with them. The quilt draped over the couch, stitched by my mother's hands. The plant on the windowsill that leaned slightly toward the light. The chipped mug I used every morning. Each object reminded me that my life was not defined by Jake and Grace, no matter how carefully they tried to rearrange its edges. In the kitchen, I filled a glass of water and sat at the table. The refrigerator hummed softly, steady and familiar. I stared at the wood grain on the tabletop, tracing the pattern with my fingertip. It was strange how betrayal sharpened the senses, how even the simple act of noticing something felt like reclaiming space. I thought about what needed to come next. Not with fear, but with the quiet focus that had carried me through years of emergencies. I would need documentation, clear steps, boundaries defined not by emotion, but by necessity. I would need the strength to act without hesitation, even when the actions felt heavy. The old filing drawer in the hallway held everything. My will, my medical directives, and the outdated power of attorney Jake once signed when he was still someone I trusted implicitly. I opened the drawer and pulled out the stack of documents. The papers felt cool against my hands. I carried them to the dining table and arranged them in a neat line, the way I used to organize patient charts during night shifts. I studied each page slowly, marking the parts that would have to change. My life needed to be reclaimed piece by piece, in the same methodical way they had tried to dismantle it. In that quiet, I understood something important. Fear had no place here. I had lived too many years witnessing the fragility of life to let fear decide anything for me now. What I needed was resolve, steady, deliberate, ethical. I stood and walked toward the bedroom. The hallway light cast a soft glow on the walls. My footsteps sounded different, not lighter but more sure. When I reached my room, I paused at the doorway. The bed was neatly made, the comforter pulled tight, the pillow creased from where I had smoothed it that morning. I sat on the edge for a moment and let out a slow breath. They won't take my life, I whispered into the dark room. And they won't take my courage. The words were not a battle cry. They were a promise made quietly to myself, strong in their softness. I turned off the light, and in the darkness, for the first time in months, I felt something settle inside me that had been missing. Something calm, certain, and immovable. Resolve. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my fear had settled into something sharper. I woke before the alarm, the room still gray with early light, and lay for a moment listening to the small sounds of the house, the heater turning on, a branch brushing the window, the faint tick of the hallway clock. My life was still here. So was the danger. I made coffee the way I always did, measuring out the grounds, listening to the slow drip. I stood at the sink watching the thin line of steam rise, and let myself feel one clean, unbroken thought. I am not helpless. They had counted on my confusion, on the version of me they'd invented in doctors' notes and whispered comments. They'd forgotten who I actually was. By 8 o'clock I was seated in a lawyer's office downtown, papers stacked neatly in my bag. The reception area smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. When my name was called, I stood without hesitation. The attorney was a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and a straightforward manner. I liked her immediately because she didn't speak to me as if I were fragile. I laid everything out, the forged signatures, the hidden messages Alex had shown me, the doctor's notes that did not match reality, the life insurance policy, the packed suitcases, the one-way ticket. I spoke calmly, the way I presented complex cases to new residents. Facts first, then sequence, then consequence. She listened without interrupting, only occasionally asking a precise question. When I finished, she rested her pen on the legal pad. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said, "we're going to put some protections in place today. We began with the essentials. I revoked Jake's power of attorney in writing. We drafted a new one naming a neutral party, a professional, not family. We changed my will, removing Jake and Grace from any inheritance." The attorney explained each section patiently, but she did not oversimplify. She treated me like a capable adult, which is all I had ever been. Next, I called my bank from her office phone on speaker. I verified my identity with the familiar security questions, my first pet, my mother's maiden name, and then requested immediate changes. New account numbers, new cards, removal of any joint access. When the representative mentioned a recent freeze authorized by your son, the attorney glanced at me and shook her head slightly, already making a note. Those freezes are to be reversed, I said calmly. Effective immediately. And no one but me has authority going forward. From there, the steps felt almost procedural. We contacted the insurance company to flag the policy as potentially fraudulent. We documented everything. Dates, times, names of every person we spoke with. The attorney made copies of the messages Alex had captured, instructing me to keep them saved in multiple places. Evidence, she called it. Protection, I thought. By midday, we had also prepared a written statement for the police. When I walked into the precinct, I carried a folder instead of fear. I spoke to an officer in a small interview room that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. I recounted the same facts yet again, my voice steady. Years of delivering difficult information had trained me for this. I watched him write, watched his eyes sharpen as the pattern emerged. Ma'am, he said finally, we'll open a formal investigation. In the meantime, do not confront them alone. I nodded. I had no intention of giving Jake or Grace the chance to reframe anything. This time I would not be the one doubting myself. The last piece was the hardest. With the attorney's guidance, I scheduled an appointment with another doctor, someone with no connection to my family, to evaluate my cognitive state. I sat in a quiet exam room later that week, answering questions, performing memory tasks, naming objects on flashcards like a schoolchild. Could have felt humiliating. Instead, it felt like reclaiming the truth on record. When the evaluation was finished, the doctor smiled slightly. Your cognition is well within normal range for your age, Mrs. Reynolds. There's no indication of decline. I asked for a copy of his report. When it landed in my hands, crisp and official, I felt something inside me lock into place. They had tried to turn my mind into their weapon. That day I took it back. At the detective's request, I agreed to small hidden cameras in the house. A technician moved quietly through my rooms, tucking tiny lenses into a smoke detector and a frame near the medicine cabinet. It felt less like spying and more like breathing clean air. Before I slept that night, I gathered all the folders, reports and notes onto my dining table. In the center lay my new documents. Around them, the evidence of what they had tried to do. The balance had begun to shift. Every signature, every form, every changed account pulled me away from the story they had written, and toward the life I intended to claim for myself at last. The days that followed moved slowly, like a clock ticking in another room. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No sirens, no confrontations, no slammed doors. Justice, I learned, doesn't arrive like thunder. It gathers itself quietly, like a tide rising inch by inch until the shoreline you thought was solid disappears. The investigators worked with a calm precision that reminded me of seasoned nurses prepping a trauma bay. They didn't rush. They didn't assume. They simply followed the evidence where it led. I answered every call, provided every document, and kept records of each small interaction, dates, times, expressions, words. My life had become a case file, and I handled it with the same diligence I once gave to charts that could save or end a life. The first cracks in Jake and Grace's world appeared not through police action, but through their own unraveling. 3 days after I installed the hidden cameras, Jake arrived at my house unannounced. I heard his car before I saw it, the familiar rumble of the old truck he refused to upgrade. I watched from the dining room window as he walked up the path, his shoulders tight, his jaw clenched. He knocked once, hard enough that the door rattled. "Mom," he called. "Open up. We need to talk." I didn't respond. I had already been instructed not to engage. He pulled out the spare key, the one he thought I didn't know he'd kept, and tried to unlock the door. But the deadbolt had been changed. The metal clicked uselessly. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mom, what's going on? Why would you change the locks?" Behind the anger in his voice, I heard something else, a flicker of worry. A man realizing the story he'd been writing was no longer following his script. He pounded once more, then stepped back, checking the windows. When he finally returned to the driveway, he stood there for a long minute, staring at my house as though it had betrayed him. Then he drove away, his tail lights disappearing slowly down the street. The next day, Grace called me twice, first with a clipped, irritated tone, then again with forced sweetness. I let both calls ring. On the third attempt, she left a message. "Martha, please call us. There's been a misunderstanding. We just want to help." The tremor in her voice wasn't concern. It was fear. By the end of that week, the detectives had enough recorded evidence to move. They informed me before they acted, their voices calm, respectful. I sat at the dining table as they spoke, the morning sun warming the surface of the wood. I nodded through each detail, steadying myself with a hand wrapped around my coffee mug. The arrests happened early on a Tuesday. Jake was taken first. He had just left a gym on the west side of town, sweat still on his shirt. According to the detective, he looked more confused than angry. I imagined his expression, the same bewilderment he wore as a child when caught in a lie he hadn't planned for. Only this time the consequences were real, written in police reports and digital trails he thought he'd hidden. Grace was arrested at home. They told me she didn't resist. She simply stood with her arms crossed, brows pulled tight, answering questions with short, clipped replies. But when she learned Jake had been taken in separately, and that he had not asked about her, something inside her shifted. She asked for a lawyer. Then she asked what Jake had said. They did not tell her. By evening, the news reached people who knew them. A neighbor texted me, confused and worried. A family friend left a voicemail asking if I needed groceries. Rumors moved through the neighborhood the way cold air moves under a door, quiet but certain. 2 days later, the detectives asked me to come in again. I sat across from them in a small interview room, the same one where I had first told my story. This time the air felt lighter. "Mrs. Reynolds," one detective said gently, "Grace has confessed. She's provided details corroborating everything you showed us, and more." I nodded, waiting. She said she didn't know Jake planned to remove her as well. The phrasing was careful. I appreciated that. I folded my hands on the table. "And Jake?" The detective exhaled slowly. "He's denying everything. Even the messages. Even the forged documents. But the evidence is substantial. His attorney is advising him to reconsider." The next morning, I received an official notice from my bank. All funds removed without authorization had been restored. A separate envelope from the insurance company confirmed that the policy was suspended pending further investigation. My house was safe. My accounts were protected. My name was clean. As for Jake and Grace, their worlds continued to contract. Grace's job placed her on immediate leave once the investigation became public record. Her company valued discretion. Police involvement did not align with their professional image. Jake's workplace followed soon after. He had been struggling there already, late deadlines, inconsistent attendance, unexplained absences. Now, with charges involving attempted harm and financial fraud, they let him go without ceremony. The two of them began turning on each other almost immediately. I heard through the detectives that their statements clashed. Jake claimed Grace orchestrated everything. Grace presented printed messages, bank transfers, and voice notes pointing back to him. The person Jake truly wanted, Lisa, sent him one final message, a brief line stating she couldn't be involved. That was her entire contribution. Their lives, once meticulously arranged, collapsed inward. They lost their money, their reputations, their carefully curated image of a stable, upward-bound couple. And finally, inevitably, they lost each other. I did not celebrate. That kind of victory holds no joy. What I felt instead was something quieter. Like the moment after a long steady rain when the ground is still wet, but the storm has moved somewhere else. The consequences belonged to them. The peace that followed belonged to me. When the legal dust finally settled, the world did not feel triumphant. It felt emptied, like a room after visitors leave, quiet, a little unfamiliar, waiting for its new purpose. I stood in my old living room the morning I decided to sell the house, sunlight stretching across the carpet, touching the places where furniture had once sat. I walked from room to room with a slow, deliberate pace, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The faint scratch on the hallway wall from moving a bookshelf, the dent in the baseboard Jake made when he was 12 and swung his backpack too wide, the small chip in the kitchen tile I never bothered to fix. Every mark carried a memory, But the memories no longer felt like home. They felt like evidence of a life that had already shifted away from me. I didn't rush the sale. I interviewed agents, checked every document twice, and chose a young couple who stepped into the house with genuine wonder. They touched the counter as though it were something precious, and I imagined them learning the sounds of the place the way I once had. The creak near the front door, the soft whine of the heater, the birds that gathered near the maple tree at dusk. Watching them made the parting easier. A house deserves to be lived in by people who see possibility instead of harm. I moved into a small apartment in Boulder. 3rd floor. Clean lines. Bright windows. The first morning I woke there, I stood barefoot on the cool hardwood floor, listening to the hum of a refrigerator that did not yet feel familiar. The light poured in gently, unbothered by history. I took a slow breath and realized the air tasted different, lighter, quieter, untouched by anyone else's intentions. I unpacked carefully, choosing each object with intention. The chipped blue mug came with me. So did the lavender candle and the quilt my mother made. The family portrait from years ago remained in a box, tucked away but not thrown out. Some things aren't ready for shelves. Some things may never be. My days became simple in a way I hadn't known I needed. I found a cafe 2 blocks away. A place where the barista remembered my order after a week. I walked there in the mornings, passing the same elm tree, the same friendly dog behind a fence, the same view of the mountains turning gold in early light. Routine became a comfort instead of a trap. No one watched me for signs of decline. No one corrected my recollections or questioned my steps. I belonged wholly to myself. I joined a photography class at the community center. I wasn't any good at first. My hands, used to medical equipment and charts, felt clumsy around a camera. But there was something grounding in learning again. Adjusting focus, noticing shadows, waiting for the smallest shift of light. One afternoon, the instructor asked us to photograph stillness. I took a picture of my own hands resting on my lap. When I looked at it later, I saw steadiness I hadn't recognized in months. My balcony became a small refuge. I placed a sturdy green plant in a clay pot and tended it each morning. I liked watching how it tilted toward the sun, adjusting itself with quiet certainty. Some evenings I sat beside it with a book, letting the air move gently across my face. The silence felt earned, not empty. From time to time, people asked cautiously how I was managing on my own. I always gave the same answer. I am not managing, I am living. And it was true. For years, my home had contained tension like static in the walls. Now my days opened softly, without fear disguised as care, without someone narrating a decline that didn't exist. Once a month, I met with a small circle of women at the library. We didn't gossip. We didn't dramatize. We discussed boundaries, documents, and the tug-of-war between loyalty and self-preservation. Some carried heartbreak heavier than mine. Some carried anger they hadn't figured out how to loosen. Sitting with them reminded me that betrayal, while deeply personal, was not uniquely mine. There was a strange comfort in that shared knowledge, like a dim light in a long hallway. I thought of Jake often. It is impossible to stop being a mother. But I learned to separate the child I raised from the man who made choices I could not follow. Loving him once did not mean keeping space for the harm he intended. That truth lived next to the hurt, and maybe always would. Even so, I did not let it define the shape of my days. My life is smaller now, 1 bedroom, a kitchen just big enough for me, a balcony with a single plant. But it is also larger in ways that matter. Fits me. My pace. My voice. My choices. There is room to breathe, to read, to stand still in the morning light and feel, for the first time in a long time, entirely unafraid. People imagine that betrayal arrives loudly. But in my experience, it begins with a changed tone, a shifted glance, a story quietly rewritten in rooms you thought were safe. And when the truth finally comes, it does not crash into your life. It settles over it, like dust gathering in slow layers until you can no longer ignore the shape underneath. In the months since everything unfolded, I've learned that healing is not a straight path. Some mornings I feel the weight of what happened like a stone in my pocket. Other mornings the world feels strangely new. Light through the blinds, the hum of the kettle, the small piece of choosing how to spend a day that belongs entirely to me. I still think of my son. Love doesn't vanish simply because trust breaks. But I understand now that loving someone does not mean handing them the right to rewrite your life. Blood is not a free pass. Family is not a shield. A person reveals who they are in the choices they repeat, not in the promises they make. I think often of the women I meet once a month at the library, the ones who sit with me in those quiet circles. Each of us carries a different story, but the thread between them is the same. A moment when we realized silence was no longer safety. In their voices I hear echoes of my own journey. Fear softened into clarity, anger softened into boundaries, grief softened into a new kind of strength. If there is anything I've taken from this year, it is this. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks in a single steady sentence. No more. Sometimes it is the quiet closing of a door, the signing of a document, the decision to protect yourself even when it feels unfamiliar. And sometimes it is simply waking up and choosing again to begin. I don't know what the future will bring. Life rarely offers guarantees. But I do know this. I will face whatever comes with my own voice, my own judgment, and my own name intact. That alone is a kind of victory. I am not the woman they tried to write into confusion. I am not the fragile figure in their fabricated notes. I am the woman who saw the truth, who stood up, who walked forward even when her heart felt cracked. And now, as I end this story, I want to say something to anyone who recognizes pieces of themselves in it. Anyone who has been dismissed, diminished, or doubted by people they trusted. You are not alone. Your clarity is not a burden. Your truth is enough. And if this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear more stories, where silence becomes strength, and where women like me find their voices again.